All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. And today is our 185th Bible Decode. This is an educational channel, and we try to turn you on to some theories and discoveries and points of view that you probably never heard before. But if you did, they'd make a big impact on your life. And this is a unit, I believe this is our 372nd video for the reciprocal church, which is kind of my vision of 8 or 9 billion of us having 8 or 9 billion different religions based on our own, what is inside of us, along with the experiences that we've had and what resonates with us. And so we've looked at a lot of different ways that you can bring out the divine, the numinous, the spiritual in your own life, from deep meditation to ecstatic music to psychedelics to sacred geometry and mathematics, and there's a few other things that we're going to get into as well. But these are for, some people could even dismiss these as being demonic or whatever. But, that's probably because you think that your religion is on much firmer ground than it really is. Because this is really a parachute for you to bail out of your religion. Because if you belong to one of the 5 major Western religions, your religion is about to crash and burn for having no evidence to support it. And that includes Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Satanism, and atheism or scientism. And out of those 5 religions I just listed, I think that Christianity is my favorite. And so if you hear me being very harsh talking about Christianity, you probably ain't seen nothing yet. But we have been, in these Bible decodes, we've been focusing on the New Testament, or the Christianity side of it, as well as the Satanism side of it, because Satanism really comes out of the New Testament much more so than the Old. The Old Testament really only uses the term Satan a few times, handful of times, and each time it's for a human being, an obstacle or an adversary, and the kind of supernatural Satan doesn't come in till later in the New Testament, and even really later in things like Hollywood. But we're focusing on the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. The New Testament was written not by illiterate Aramaic-speaking fishermen in Judea, but by the Roman emperors of the Flavian dynasty. That is Emperor Vespasian and his 2 children, Emperors Titus and Domitian, that were in charge of the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. And Titus and Vespasian were just fresh off a war against the Jews. Call it War of the Jews, from 66 to 73 AD. They had both been wounded in the war, and they had been privy to the over 1 full century of constant revolts, uprising, and insurrections coming from the Jews ever since the Romans first took over in Judea in 63 BC. And they recognized that the Jews were a major problem for governing in the Roman Empire because particularly of their Jews' belief in a monotheistic God who was jealous and zealous and considered his followers the chosen people, leading to separatism and xenophobia on their part. God was also obsessive compulsive and had a major smoking addiction to animal fat, which led to a lot of rituals for animal sacrifices and kosher food laws and sanitary laws and circumcision. And God was also insecure and indecisive and also far from omnipotent in that he needed to take a break every 7 days, which was the Sabbath. So those were all the rituals that he put on his people that made them difficult to govern for the Romans, because the Jews were literally willing to, many of them were literally willing to die to uphold their rituals and their strictures. They also had this stricture against graven images. When Caligula, Emperor Caligula, tried to put his statue in the temple, the Jews basically went to war against him. So, that's the kind of stance that the Jews had. And Vespasian and Titus, among other Roman royals, had the idea to reach into their bag of tricks, which was a well-used bag. They did this a lot, and to try to pull off a psychological operation against the Jews by taking advantage of the fact that they knew that the Jews were waiting on a Messiah, but that Messiah was a military commander who would help them overthrow the Jews. And three Jewish zealots were self-proclaimed messiahs that came to the fore in 66 AD and actually did kick out the Herod Agrippa II, who was the puppet ruler of Jerusalem, and sent him packing back to Rome. And so that caused Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. And so the Romans knew the power of this, this military Messiah that the Jews were waiting for. And so instead they wrote a story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, turning the other cheek to oppression, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's backpack, citing that the Roman slave-owning centurion had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and asking his father to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do, while never ever once asking his father to forgive the Jews, and going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the money changers who were Jewish, and disrupting the commerce of the Jews who were selling small animals for the sacrifice, who were Jews. So again, Jesus is the Jesus that the Romans created, acts as exactly as if the Romans had created him. He is completely deferential to the Romans throughout the Gospels. There is not a single episode in the Gospels where Jesus does or says anything counter to the Romans. The closest he gets is when somebody asked him for alms, and he says, these are for our people, or something to that effect. And that he talks about, he doesn't say pearls before swine, but something to that effect. I'll have to find the exact reference. But that's the closest he gets. Otherwise, nothing said negative about about the Romans, but constant jabbing at the Jews, especially their rituals. Even when Jesus is asked to recount the 10 Commandments, he only cites 5. Titus and Vespasian are literally sabotaging the Jewish religion. And then what's worse is that Titus literally inserts himself as the culmination of the religion. So this religion that's based on who begat whom, bloodlines going all the way back to Adam, and how many, 42 generations of Jews up to Jesus, and then it goes to Titus and it's over. So Titus inserts himself as the second coming of Jesus. And he does this by writing the Gospels, backdating it by 40 years, making a bunch of prophecies that Jesus makes, and making them identical to the deeds that Titus commits in the war of the Jews. In particular, the sacking and total destruction and desecration of Jerusalem. And that is the primary prophecy that Jesus makes that is going to be the triggering of my second coming. He says it's going to happen during the lifetime of some of you who are listening to me. And it happens 40 years later in 70 AD when Titus destroys utterly the city of Jerusalem. And this is documented in a history that was written by the Romans called Jewish War, or War of the Jews. 7 volumes, endorsed by Titus, written by somebody named Josephus, who claimed to have been a Jew who defected to the Romans and was adopted as a member of the Flavian dynasty. He's known as Flavius Josephus. He lived in a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and he was one of the court historians for the Romans. But it goes way further than that, because whoever wrote Josephus, who undoubtedly emanated from Rome, is also whoever wrote the Gospels. Written at the same time by the same people for the same reason. And that is to show a great deal of parallels between the two that you can decode if you know the inside joke. And the inside joke is very mocking and ridiculing and demeaning toward the Jews and really anybody who believes it. And the parallels are legion. So Titus is attempting to, the Flavians are attempting to insert themselves as the culmination of the Jewish tradition in order to mellow out the Jews. They come up with this Jewish Messiah who is mellowed out. And Then, at the same time, they write this Josephus, which presents so many parallels between the Gospels that they're encoding messages. So you can look at the 3-year ministry of Jesus as a mirror or a replica of the 3-year military campaign of Titus, as written in War of the Jews. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order. And they encounter parallel events at each location that are spaced out 40 years apart. And it's not just a couple of events, it's over 40 separate events. I won't say separate, because quite a few of them are related, but 40 events that are all in the same order in the book of Luke and in Jewish war. That was documented by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah. Later, that came out in 2005. In just last year, Michael Menescott, Menasgotz, in his book Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, documents even more parallels between the book of Luke and War of the Jews. He found over 250 parallels, and some of them are utterly devastating. Not all of them, but enough of them to be very sure that we're talking about intentionality, not coincidence. And not to even go further, Menescott graphs the parallels on a chart. Book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plots a point for every parallel that he finds. After plotting the 250 plus points, he has formed 5 near perfect letters in Latin, APTVS. Latin was the language of the Roman government, whereas most people in Rome spoke Greek, which is the language of the Gospels and the language of Josephus. Whereas Jesus and his disciples and most everyone in Judea were speaking in Aramaic, and Greek was much more of a minority, privilege religion. But the upshot basically is that not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they signed their name to it to mock you. And they've been doing so for almost 2,000 years now. I don't think they thought it was going to last this long. Some of the stuff is very well hidden, but most of it is cognitive dissonance. People can see it right in front of their face, but they want to believe in Jesus so bad that, or they want to believe in Josephus so bad that they can't possibly come to grips with the fact that they were the same. They were this one and the same. But the circumstantial evidence is also overwhelming. Like I said, this was right, perfect motive. The Jews had been a thorn in the side of the Romans for over 100 years. This was going to prune them or domesticate them, tame them, restrain them. This was exactly what the Romans would do in this type of situation, and what they did do in other situations in the first century, where they created entire religions for the purposes of psychological warfare. And the Romans also had a monopoly on censorship, a monopoly on publishing, a monopoly on distribution. Nobody was publishing anything in the Roman Empire unless Caesar approved of it. And Caesar didn't approve of very much, because there wasn't that much that, and, you know, moreover, a lot of what, you know, Caesar even permitted was then censored by Christians later on. Also, all of the other part of it is that the Christianity part, as we really saw when we were going over Lee Strobel's book of Christian apologists, all these different apologists that he interviews, that they really are deluded in thinking that there is so much more evidence for the existence of Christianity than there really is. They think that they're on safe ground, and so they keep trying to colonize further ground, not realizing that there is actually, and I challenge anybody to provide me with one single piece of evidence for the existence of Christianity. All of the evidence is Roman. You know, the top evidence, corroborating evidence for the existence of Jesus is Josephus. He's the only first century author to even allude, other than the Gospels and other than the New Testament, to even allude to Jesus. The others in the 2nd century, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Trajan, Emperor Trajan, they're all Roman royals. So, you know, so they were in on it. And their corroboration of the fact was just in order to historicize Jesus. They didn't believe it really happened. This is a myth. This is a fiction, and there is no evidence to support it. There is exactly the same amount of evidence for the existence of Jesus as there is for the existence of Santa Claus. And that is what Christians are going to have to get their arms around, is that at some point you stopped believing in Santa Claus. Maybe you had a big brother or a neighbor down the street who was a couple years older, and he convinced you, you know, I'm really sorry, you know, I know you want to believe in Santa Claus, but he's fake. I figured it out, you know, and you struggled against him for a couple years, but eventually you recognized that Santa Claus was fake. Jesus is fake too. This is just, now you're an adult, but it's the same situation. There is no evidence, and this is going to have to stop, because you know, it leads to mental illness. Now, I would say a fairly minor mental illness. The thing about the Romans is that the Romans wanted, when in this psychological operation, the Romans want you to be a good citizen. The Romans want you to obey the law, to be hardworking, and to be, you know, to turn the other cheek. And so most Christians reflect those values. Most Christians are very good citizens and good people. But it's not really because of Jesus. It's really almost in spite of Jesus. But even if it is because of Jesus, it's still a lie. It still never happened. And so, you know, that's why I'm putting out these videos, because we've got to pick up the pieces and move on. This never happened, and this has got to stop. Okay, now what we're looking at now is a book called Nailed by David Fitzgerald. He's pretty much an atheist, skeptic of Christianity, and just like Lee Strobel, though, his work suffers from the fact that he does not know the Roman origins hypothesis. And I will also say again that I have even less, respect and, affinity for atheism / scientism than I do for Christianity, because scientists are supposed to be objective, and Christians don't. At least they don't, claim that they're objective, but scientists are supposed to be objective, but they've ended up just being really political in general. If you look at Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions, showing how, Copernicus, Galileo, Bruno, all the way up to Newton, it took like 150 years practically for the scientific community to finally accept the Newtonian universe. And there are a million other stories about things like the paradigm shifting, that scientists will bend over backwards to support their current theory as opposed to another theory that has better evidence. Such as the thing that you roll up your sleeve to get in the last 5 years, and the thing that they call climate change, and often write it in capital letters, and evolution written in capital letters. These are just as dubious as Jesus is. So we'll see where Mr. Fitzgerald goes, because he does bring up some good points. He really is focusing on like 12 myths that Christians hold that do not stand up. So now he's talking about Josephus's Testimonium Flavianum, or which is, I don't think Josephus called it that, but this is his paragraph in the middle of his 20-volume work called Antiquities of the Jews, which he wrote 20 years later than War of the Jews. But this is the place that he refers to Jesus in this one paragraph, which most scholars reject because it's a non sequitur. It's between two paragraphs that would make perfect sense if you omitted the paragraph about Jesus. But this is not the view of Joseph Atwill. Joseph Atwill thinks that it's part of a code, so that the 3 paragraphs actually do make perfect sense together. But you have to understand Roman mythology, especially this mythology called Decius Mus, which is like the soldier who sacrifices for the, in the case of Decius Mus, for the Romans. But in Josephus, the character is Decius Mundus, which is the sacrifice for the whole world. And if you understand that these distinctions, then the Testimonium Flavianum, not only does it make sense, but it also is really another signature of the people who actually did this. And it looks like it was Josephus, whoever Josephus was, his and 2 other Jews, Tiberius Alexander and Bernice, Queen Bernice, who was like a Hasmonean or a Maccabee. They kind of admit in the Testimonium Flavianum that they did it. But the Testimonium Flavianum never appears in any of the church fathers' writings or anything until we get all the way up to Eusebius in the early 4th century. And this includes Origen, or Origen, or however you pronounce his name, who was early 3rd century, and he was the teacher of Eusebius. And in Origen's copy of Antiquities of the Jews, he doesn't refer to the Testimonium, even though he should have. In a context where he should have referred to it, he didn't. But 2 generations later, or 2+ generations later, in Eusebius, who they might have actually even been reading the same copy of the book, because it was passed down from one to the other to the next. But it is in Eusebius, but it is not in Origen. So Origen, who never heard of the passage, Eusebius cites it. So it was probably Eusebius who did it, if it was actually done. Question: maybe Origen just glazed over on it also, but Eusebius was like the right-hand man to Constantine, Emperor Constantine, who is credited as really the creator of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. The second alleged mention of Jesus and Josephus is the James reference in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, which appears to make a reference to James, the brother of Jesus. But that's questionable. Now, what he says is Josephus's report of a trial and death sentence carried out on James and his companions is completely at odds with all other accounts of James's death. And he cites like Hegesippus, who is a late 4th century author who definitely took great liberties with Josephus. And kind of like turned Josephus around to be almost anti-Jew, even though Josephus was a Jew. He was a traitor and he was a defector, but he felt like he had reasons for doing that. He believed that now God favors the Romans and not the Jews, and we as Jews have to just accept that. And Hegesippus is instead saying that Josephus is saying that the Jews are being punished for killing Jesus. And that's his whole thing. And Josephus never talks about that. So, well, I have to admit that I've only read like the first 10 books of Antiquities of the Jews. So I haven't read this particular passage. I have read the passage, but not in context of the rest of the book. Okay, so when he identifies Jesus as, or James as the brother of Jesus, then there is the sentence or the phrase, who was called Christ. And most scholars believe that that was also an interpolation, meaning that it was inserted into the text, possibly by mistake. It might have been